Does this map look familiar to you? Do you understand the current situation in the war in Ukraine? Fret not, because I am here to explain exactly the current situation. When you're done with this video, you know exactly what is going on, to the point where you can take political decisions better than Zelensky himself or even Putin. This video is intended for you who has never heard of Ukraine or Russia, who wants to get into the current situation of the war in Ukraine. To you who is overloaded with propaganda and have no idea what's going on. And to you who simply do not have enough time to get through all of the sea of information available about the war in Ukraine and just want the simple, direct update on how the map moves and what tactics are being used and what developments are taking place in this war and what it means for the war itself. This video will tell you exactly what every single one of these map layers mean, how to understand the current situation, exactly what is happening in the war in Ukraine on a daily basis, and completely without any propaganda. My channel is Weebunion, and my project is to bring you the direct, unfiltered, and honest truth about what happens on the front line. I go through an endless sea of information and propaganda, filtering off the complete bullshit and bringing you the best of it so you don't have to. I pride myself with timely updates and accurate information. If something is not accurate, there is complete and full transparency, and I have apologized every single time I've made a single mistake, which has happened twice of over 1,000 videos. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Starting out, let's introduce the current situation across the front line. Starting out in the southwest, the Kherson direction, as it is named due to the fighting taking place all within the Kherson region, which is situated here in southern Ukraine. This is the Kherson region under the Russian control, and this is the Kherson region under Ukrainian control. It is split exactly by the Dnieper River. The Dnieper River has seen a lot of positional fighting, which is fighting that takes place to determine small positional changes where either side wants a slight improvement to have a better position in the long term, as this is a battle of attrition largely, which means that both sides are attempting to grind down the opposite side at a faster rate than they can recuperate their strength. The current situation in the Kherson direction is that the Ukrainians have attempted to get a foothold across the Dnieper River, which was a battle that took place in the town of Krinky for many months. However, after so many months of fighting, the Ukrainians failed to gain their foothold, and it ended up being a situation of complete stalemate, separated by the Dnieper River of the Russian and Ukrainian control. In the next section, we have the Zaporizhzhia front. The Zaporizhzhia front is split into two parts, the western parts and the eastern parts. The reason for this split is that the Ukrainian summer offensive, which took place in the summer of 2023, took place mainly in the Robotyne direction. This led to many changes of the front line, and this also means that the front line has to change a lot. The Google My Maps, which I am using to make my own map, has a limit on how many points can be made. So the more changes there are, and the more accurate the front line is, the more points are made, and this limits the size of the front line. Therefore, large sections of the front line with a lot of changes have to be split up into multiple parts. This is why such a region as the Donetsk region, which has seen some of the most fighting, as well as the Luhansk region, are split into the most parts, as there simply is that many points to be made with so many territorial changes at a constant basis. So we see that the Zaporizhzhia region is split into two, the eastern and western parts, as they were three different parts of the front line where the Ukrainian summer offensive took place. The southwestern parts of the Donetsk region by the Remetsky Ledge area, south of Velika Novosibirsk, north of Seremenivka, in the Odhiv direction towards Robotine, and in the very western parts by Stepove, Lokove, and Pyatatki. The Ukrainian summer offensive took place in the summer of 2023. Prior to it, I expected and predicted that the Ukrainian summer offensive would fail due to Zaluzhny himself going out and speaking publicly that there was a significant lack of equipment compared to what was needed for a successful offensive. Not to mention that the Russians had air superiority in this section of the front line and throughout the whole section of the front line, really. This is due to the Ukrainian lack of a capable air force, as the majority of their fighter jets had already been destroyed, and due to the intensive air defense network that the Russians had available. While the Ukrainians had started at that point to receive their own air defense, it was not enough to deal with the Russian Air Force. And the Russian Air Force, especially the Ka-52 helicopters, played a significant role in holding back the Ukrainian summer offensive. The Ukrainians managed to breach Russia's first line of defense, the Surovikin line, which brings us to one of the layers of my mapping. My mapping has several layers. One of such layers is the fortified lines of the Russians that they built in anticipation of the Ukrainian summer offensive. And this is exactly that defensive line. We see that the Russians have built several layers of fortified positions. This has been mapped out by one of my sources who made this map possible, Clement Molin. You can find his Twitter here in the description of my map. The link to my map is in the description below in my YouTube video. So thanks to him doing a lot of work, he has mapped out the fortified positions of the Russians ahead of the Ukrainian summer offensive. These lines painted out in yellow throughout the country are all fortified positions. It ranges from concrete blocks, concrete bunkers, dragon teeth fortifications, trenches, anti-tank ditches, and anything else you can think of. Anything that has been detected by video or satellite imagery has been mapped out by him. And this is not limited to what the Russians have built in Ukraine during this war. It also includes Ukrainian fortified positions, the 2014 line of defense, and much more. All of this was located and mapped out by Clement Molin, so make sure to check him out for his extensive work. Moving on to the Donetsk region, we see that the main part of the Donetsk region of the front line is split into two parts. There's the central parts and the northern part. The central part is located from Volodar in the south all the way to Avdiivka in the north. This is where the main current ongoing Russian offensive is taking place. This Russian offensive is taking place with the use of a specific army group, which brings us to another layer on my map, which is the army groups layer. This shows exactly which army group of each side is in control of which region. In the Belgorod and Kursk regions, the Russians have the army group Sever, which means army group north. Similarly, the Ukrainians have their own army group north in the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. The Russians then have additional army groups that number more than what the Ukrainians have available. They have the army group Zapad, which means west, which is located in the northern section of the Luhansk and Kharkiv border. There's army group Yug, which is located here in the Bakhmut and Toretsk direction. There's army group Center, which is the central part and main part of the Russian army, and it is based off of the central military district in Russia. Following the group Center, there is group Vostok and group Dnepro, which is all in the south and located to defend the positions of the Russians from the Donetsk region and the southern parts of it all the way to the Kherson direction and the Dnieper River. These two groups are mainly focused around the Zaporizhzhia front and the Kherson direction. These army groups are not equally large, and there's a lot more information behind them, which most of is completely secretive. So despite me having sources from both the Russian and Ukrainian side, I do not have information that is detailed about any of these army groups, much less their location. This is all based on reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and general soldiers fighting on the front line who leaked a little too much information. But from what is presented and what the current situation is like, we can tell that the most experienced, most well-equipped, and well-trained forces of the Russians is the Army Group Center, and for the Ukrainians, it is Army Group North. The Ukrainian Army Group North is the one that is currently conducting the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, but more on that later. So the current situation in the Donetsk region is that the Russians is launching one massive offensive here in the Pokrovsk direction. This offensive has three parts. The first part is the western part directly from the Avdiivka direction through the town of Ocheretine, along the railways and directly towards Pokrovsk. This Russian offensive has one goal, and that is to take control over the Pokrovsk city. The reason for this is that there are several railways and supply lines that go through from the city of Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia along the Dnieper River through Pokrovsk before it reaches the towns and cities of Konstantinivka, Droshkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk. This is a significant portion of supplies that goes into the Donetsk region, and it also one of the main supply points for the Ukrainian armed forces here in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. This means that approximately half of the Ukrainian supplies in the Donetsk region goes through Pokrovsk. Now, how exactly do we get a better understanding on how the situation is right now and understand what the developments are recently? And did I really say I was transparent with my sources? Well, this is all in yet another layer. The recap of the month of August. For every single change, I make a recap overlay on top of the mapping. This is to show the exact changes that have happened throughout the month, which goes into a separate map called the recap map. This is due to the limit of layers that are available for the mapping. So I have one layer for each month for a whole year. And this goes into a separate map called Recap Map 2024 for the year of 2024, which is unfortunately only available for Patreon and YouTube members, which is a paid membership. Every single source is connected to my Telegram channel, and the vast majority of my sources are two sources specifically, mainly Syriac maps, and in addition to Syriac maps, another reliant source that I'm constantly using is Deep State Map. A third reliable source is this channel here, who looks through videos and footage of combat in the war and geolocates the footage to make territorial changes. And this channel is another one that I use regularly. So these are the three channels that I mainly use. Deep State Map is a reliable source. However, there is one major flaw, and that is that they are pro-Ukrainian. This means that at times they hold back their reports in support of the Ukrainian ventures. At the same time, they have this biased outlook over the war, where they sometimes twist situations and developments into Ukraine's favor. That means I cannot use this map entirely without any issue. The most reliable source is Syriac Maps, and I cannot stress this enough. Since 2017, as far as I know, he has been working on several maps. These maps include a map over the Syrian Civil War, the Iraq War, Yemen Civil War, Libyan Civil War, the Russo-Ukrainian War, the Caucasus map, the Sahel map, and the Gaza map most recently. But these are a series of conflicts that he reports on every single one of them. This adds to a long vast portfolio of multiple maps he has been working on, and his experience and ability to discern what is truth and what is fact, what is a real development and what is not, what is PR propaganda and what is reality. This has allowed him to come up on top with the most reliable map on this war. And I say this without any remorse. He is the number one most reliable map, and no one can compare to his mapping. The final layer I've yet to talk about is the actions map. There are only 2 points to this map. First one is fighting reported, which is when the Russians or the Ukrainians have managed to advance. I point towards different directions where fighting is taking place. For example, this recent advance in the Selidova direction, which I've yet to report on. This advance took place within the eastern parts of the town. The Russians are fighting in 4 separate directions to make this advance possible. They're fighting in a western direction. This is taking place in the gray area, as well as towards the apartment complex area in the central parts of the town. At the same time, they are also advancing in the southern parts of the river, again towards the apartment complex areas in the central parts of the town, but on the southern side of the river. At the same time, there's a gray area to the south of the central parts of what the Russians have captured. This points towards fighting taking place in this direction. At the same time, the Russians have reached a fortified section of the front line where the Ukrainian fortified positions are available. This points towards fighting taking place there as well. These fighting reported are by my own discretion. This means that these are areas I believe, based on territorial changes, that fighting is taking place. The second part is when a town, settlement, village, city is captured. I mark that with a captured sign. In this case, Selidova has not been captured, therefore until the fighting ends and the town has been captured, there will not appear a captured mark until it has been fully captured. Now that you know about every single layer on my map, we can go on to explain the current situation properly. The Russians have managed to capture approximately 220 square kilometers here in the Pokrovsk section over the past month. Taking a look at the recap map for the past year, this is the number 1 month of most territory captured, both generally across the entirety of the front line, but most importantly in the Pokrovsk section of the front line. Previously, it was when the Russians captured the city of Avdiivka, the Russians captured 90 square kilometers in the Pokrovsk section of the front line. The second was the previous month, which was the month of July, where the Russians captured approximately 64 square kilometers in the Pokrovsk section of the front line. So you see, the Russians have already doubled the record of the most territory captured by the Russians in the Pokrovsk section of the front line this year, this month, and they are constantly advancing further, with the latest advance being the one on yesterday, the 28th of August, where they managed to capture 75 square kilometers across the entirety section of the front line in a single day. Now that is very impressive considering the layers of fortified positions the Ukrainians have available in this section of the front line. We see that there are 2 lines of defense that the Ukrainians had in this area. There's one here by Serhivka in the east of Rodivka, ahead of the city, which the Russians have managed to capture at the start of the month in its entirety. A second portion of that line of defense is located east of Novorodivka and Mikhailivka, which again the Russians have managed to capture during this month. The next line of defense goes from the northwestern side of Rodivka through Mykolaivka, down south to the north of Novorodivka, and then from the railways through Chasiv Yar and the towns and villages to the northwest of Novorodivka. And that is the final line of defense of the Ukrainians ahead of the city of Pokrovsk, where there are some fortified positions on the outskirts of the city. However, they are not very significant, and within the city there's not a lot of defenses prepared. This means that the battle is at its toughest point for the Ukrainians, as Russians have just managed to breach the final line of defense ahead of the city defenses itself here in this section of the front line. This means that the Russians are now extremely close to the city of Mirnorad, just east of Pokrovsk, and very close to Pokrovsk itself as well. So we see that in this section of the front line, if the Russians continue at the current rate of advance, they would have captured the city of Pokrovsk next month. So this is a very critical point for the Ukrainians, because what was so important about Pokrovsk, it is that it is one of the main supply places of the Ukrainians in this region, and they supply about half of the supplies in the Donetsk region. If you take a look to the south in the direction of Kurakhove, the Russians are also moving in this direction as well. The Russians are here launching two offensives at the same time. There's an offensive moving towards Pokrovsk, but they're also moving in a southern direction along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. This has allowed the Russians to gain a foothold in the central parts of Selidove after just 2 days of fighting, and heavy fighting is taking place in the central parts of the town. At the same time, the Russians are moving further south in the direction of the villages of Ukrainsk and flanking the village of Karelivka to the east, which there are already reports surfacing that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from due to the danger of encirclement. And a danger of encirclement there really is, because if the Russians continue at the current pace in the southern direction, before the month of September is over, the Russians will have reached the Vovcha River line and the Kurakhove Reservoir here to the north of the town, and managed to physically cut the entirety of the road from Selidove and down south to Kurakhove, completely cutting off any possible supplies going through this area right here. At the same time, the Russians have a presence in Krasnoyarivka following the capture of 80% of the city, as well as a presence in Maximilianivka, which they can use to push here towards the southern parts of the Ukrainian positions in the long range of villages here along the Vovcha River line, which the Ukrainians have a significant portion of the units defending this section of the front line located within. If the Russians capture and cut off the western road here in the direction of Pokrovsk and the southern road in the direction of Kurakhove, the Ukrainians would here be completely encircled. Therefore, this single operation is very active in two directions, and a third direction is also being developed. This is due to the Russians crossing the river line here in a northern direction. At the same time as they have control over Novoalexandrivka, the Ukrainians currently have a strong fortified position with a river line to the southern flank, a river line to the eastern flank, and a very narrow corridor to move through. The Ukrainians here have several fortified positions as a choke point for the Russians to be unable to break through, to cut off a very essential supply line between the city of Pokrovsk with the city of Konstantinivka. Now that the Russians have managed to cross over one of the river lines and gain a foothold in the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in this section of the front line, further developments can be expected as the Russians would attempt to push to gain control over this intersection in the central parts, right in the middle between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, to cut this supply line for the Ukrainians. At the same time, another offensive is taking place by the Russians, although less active and less successful, it is still happening, and that is the Russian combined offensive between the city of Bakhmut towards Chasiv Yar and from the city of Orelivka towards Toretsk. Starting out in the Toretsk direction, the Russians have managed to capture the city of New York and has managed to capture the extensive part of this front line, which is located along the 2014 line of defense. We see several fortified positions of the Ukrainians, which has been captured by the Russians this month. This has allowed the Russians to significantly improve their positions in this section of the front line and gain control over the city of New York. At the same time, the Russians are storming the city of Toretsk, which is another well-fortified position along the 2014 line of defense. Last month, the Russians captured this entire area filled with fortified positions of the Ukrainians. This led them to fight over the second line of defense, which is located here between the town of Pivnishne in the north down south to the northwestern outskirts of Selizhne. This was a defensive position which was located and connected between two waste heaps, which are massive hills in the eastern outskirts of Toretsk, where fortified positions were both on top of and right next to these waste heaps. These are high points which were significant for Ukraine's defensive positions in the area. The Russians managed to gain control over both of these this month, which has led to the Russians gaining a foothold in the southern parts of Toretsk and the northern parts of Toretsk, where they managed to capture this micro-district with apartment complexes, which is a significant position to gain control of, as apartment complexes typically have multiple stories, which allows whoever controls them to have a vantage point where they overlook the general area. The Russians now on top of the rooftops in the apartment complex areas will have a wide view over the Ukrainian positions in the residential area in the eastern parts of Toretsk, which has led to further advances by the Russians. The current main objective of the Russians is to gain control over this prison in the eastern outskirts of Toretsk and this hill just south of it, which will allow the Russians to solidify their control over the eastern parts of Toretsk. The forest area, the prison area, and the hill will allow the Russians to have a strong control over the eastern outskirts of Toretsk and develop offensive operations within the residential area in the northern and southern parts, and have a strong connection between the two flanks. This means that the current situation in the Toretsk section of the front line points towards the Russians gaining a proper control over the eastern parts of the city before engaging in fighting in the southern micro-district that is separated by the hills and this river line going through the central parts of the city, as well as the northern part, which is by the eastern micro-district, which the Russians have captured the majority of, leaving a small part in the gray zone and their foothold in the residential area. So heavy fighting is taking place in the Toretsk section of the front line and within the city itself, the control of which would lead the Russians to have a strong position southeast of the city of Konstantinivka, strengthen the Russian positions and allow them to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions just north of Avdiivka, which is a position which the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to for a very long time. If the Russians managed to secure the northern flank of Avdiivka, they would prevent the Ukrainians from being able to launch a counterattack from the northern flank of Avdiivka and strengthen their positions to launch further offensive operations in the direction of Konstantinivka in the future. The second part of this offensive is the Chasiv Yar direction, where there is this canal separating the Russian and Ukrainian position. Similar to the Dnieper River in the Kherson direction, the Russians and the Ukrainians in the canal micro-district of Chasiv Yar fought over the positions for a very, very long time. This spanned for over a year of fighting before the Russians finally got control of it, which has led to them now gaining a foothold on the western bank of it, where the Russians' objective is to expand their foothold to control the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar and develop an offensive operation towards the central parts of the city and gain full control of it, while the Ukrainians are at the same time attempting to counterattack and regain positions and deny the Russian foothold across the canal micro-district and the canal line, which allows the Russians to develop offensive operations. This means that the Ukrainians are here looking to cut off the Russian positions and regain full control over the canal line, while the Russians are looking to expand it and gain a proper foothold to develop offensive operations towards Chasiv Yar proper. The city of Chasiv Yar is located on the high ground over this entire section of the front line. If the Russians gain control over Chasiv Yar, it will only be a matter of time for them to capture the rest of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in this line of defense, located from Slovyansk in the north all the way down south to Chasiv Yar in the south. Gaining full control over this line would allow the Russians to have control over this fortified position to the west of Siversk, while there is the Siversko-Donetsk river line to the north of Siversk, which would mean that the Ukrainians within this section of the front line would essentially be completely cut off. This means that the Russians here are looking to gain control over Chasiv Yar and use that as a springboard to expand their offensive operations significantly to gain full control over the eastern parts of the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line, which is the main defensive Ukrainian position in the Donetsk region. If the Russians gain control over this defensive line, they would gain full control over the entirety of the Donetsk region. And this is exactly why the Ukrainians have really prioritized the defense of Chasiv Yar over many other areas, and this is why the Russian advances in the Chasiv Yar direction is just a few square kilometers in a single-digit amount, while the Russian advances in the New York Toretsk direction is a two-digit advance at about 60 square kilometers, and the advances in the Pokrovsk direction is a three-digit advance at over 200 square kilometers in a single month. This shows exactly where the Russians are prioritizing their offensive operations and where the Ukrainians are prioritizing their defensive operations, as well as the density and intensity of the Ukrainian defensive positions. The Russians have captured several significant fortified positions, leaving little fortified positions remaining for the Ukrainians, which has sped up the Russian advances, while in the Toretsk and Chasiv Yar directions there are still several obstacles for the Russian advance, which has led to the Ukrainians making use of the advantageous positions in their fortified areas to halt and slow down the Russian advances. In the northern front, in the northern parts of the Donetsk region, as well as the Kupiansk section here in the Kharkiv-Luhansk border area, there is not a lot of movement. This is mainly due to the fact that the Russians have been unable to concentrate a large force to launch offensive operations due to the vulnerability of this section of the front line. In this section of the front line, the vast majority of the front line is simply open fields, which means that the vehicles are clear and open targets for both artillery, FPV drones, and mines. Any operation is quickly spotted and taken care of. This makes it very difficult for either side to move this front line, and it has remained fairly stable since the fall of 2022. That means the better part of 2 years. The Ukrainians also have several layers of defensive positions, although not as dense or numerous as the ones within the main part of the Donetsk region. There still is a significant part, mainly centered around Liman and the flanks of it. The crossings across the Uskar River line and the Serbets River line acts as a natural barrier, moving all the way from the south in the Liman direction, all the way to the north towards Stelmahivka, where heavy fighting is taking place by, and as we can see, the front line is mainly split along this river line, with the Russian foothold in the central parts near Svatove, on the western bank of the river line, and the Ukrainians having control over the eastern parts of the river line near Liman, which is one of their strong points and supply areas, similar to how Svatove is one of the strong points and supply areas of the Russians. The Russians have also made defense-in-depth lines in case of a Ukrainian offensive operation to prevent the Ukrainians from launching an offensive operation and breaking through the Russian lines in the north. So we see that throughout the front line, the Russians are on the offensive, they have the initiative, which has led to me basing my analysis on what the Russians will do, as when you are on the offensive, you choose exactly where you want to strike and how to strike. Moving on to the final section of the front line, we have the Kharkiv section, which has been largely stable since the initial push by the Russians. The Russians launched the Kharkiv offensive in the month of May, which is now 3 months ago, where they managed to gain a foothold in 2 separate areas. The objective was to connect the 2 of them, as well as gain control over the towns of Lipsy, Vesele, and Vovchansk. The Russians managed to gain control of some of the towns and a foothold in both of these areas, but did not manage to connect the front line or gain control over Vovchansk, Vesele, and Lipsy. Instead, they gained their main objective, which was to redirect Ukrainian soldiers to the northern front. And according to open source information, the Ukrainians have sent approximately 30,000 troops to the north, while open sources point towards the Russians having committed only about 10,000 soldiers to this section of the front line. The Ukrainians took advantage of this as the Russians were planning a second offensive in the Sumy direction, where they would repeat what they did in the Kharkiv direction, gain a foothold, capture some of the frontline towns and villages, and draw the Ukrainian forces in this direction. Instead, while they were removing some of the mines and fortified positions to prepare for their own offensive operation, the Ukrainians detected that movement and decided to bet it all on a massive offensive into the Kursk direction. This has led to the Ukrainians capturing about 800 square kilometers, capturing the Russians off guard, and managing to make significant advances in this section of the front line, capturing an important town such as Zaporizhzhia. They also managed to reach Kurakhove, which was another one of their objectives. However, they have been unable to take control over the town. This led to the Russians recapturing the eastern outskirts of it, and the main reason for the Ukrainian difficulties in this direction is that there is this river line separating the western parts and eastern parts of Kurakhove. This means that the Ukrainians managed to gain a foothold in the eastern parts and even attempted to cross the river line. However, they were destroyed on their move and were unable to cross over. This led to the Ukrainians to take advantage of their creative mind to launch additional operations, which has led to them launching deep strike DRG operations, which is pretty much launching armored vehicles and units deep into Russian positions, where they were establishing ambush to prevent the Russians from gathering a large force, to detect Russian forces on the move, to attack Russian forces on the move, and generally to make the best of the current situation that they're in. And at the same time, they planned on flanking Kurakhove by launching attacks to the north, bypassing the first line, by strengthening their positions in the north, and then flanking Kurakhove from that direction. However, this was also failed as the Ukrainians were pushed back by a Russian counterattack. They are now instead focusing on the eastern parts, where the Russians have been unable to properly establish frontline positions, and stabilizing the front, the Ukrainians took advantage of that to launch deep operations in areas that are difficult for the Russians to defend. Areas such as this one to the northeast of Kurakhove, where there are several forest areas but no real towns or villages, which the Ukrainians took advantage of to reach deep into Russian territory and set up ambushes when the Russians were moving through some of these villages and towns. At the same time, they've managed to make significant advances in the eastern parts as well, pushing the Russians back both in the direction of Martinovka as well as here to the northwest by Nekhaev, where additional advances that have yet to be mapped out has taken place. The Ukrainians continue with a second push, where the objective is not just to expand their current foothold in the eastern parts, but they've also struck all of the bridges across the Reka Same River that actually spans from the border area between Russia and Ukraine through the northern parts of these towns and villages and all the way east to territory which is now under Ukrainian control. This means that the Russians are fighting the Ukrainians with their backs to a river. And now that the Ukrainians have blown up all of the bridges, their supply is limited. The Ukrainian objective here is to siege the Russians by preventing supply as much as they can, slowly starve out the Russians while launching positional fighting on the flanks, where they are looking to gain control over this region here to the south of the river line. This will create a strong flank for the Ukrainians to then push towards Kurakhove in a third wave. This, however, has seen the Russians constantly building pontoon bridges and alternatives to supply the Russian troops south of the river line. The Ukrainians are constantly hitting these, but the Russians are not stopping with building new ones, and they are hitting the Ukrainian capabilities to launch attacks on these bridges by destroying what the Ukrainians are using, such as the HIMARS systems, to launch attacks and again be hit themselves. So it is a battle of attrition over how many bridges can the Russians build across the river line and how many HIMARS systems can the Ukrainians use to hit these bridges at a constant rate, and can the Russians get rid of the Ukrainian reconnaissance in this direction. So you see, heavy fighting is taking place in the Kursk direction, and this offensive is far from over. However, the Ukrainians did take it one step too far and are risking a lot more by entering Russian territory, and the main reason for that is that the Russian positions in the Kursk region is similar to that of the Ukrainian positions in the Liman direction, and that is the majority of the positions are out in the open fields, which means that any vehicles are very quickly detected and are prime targets for artillery, MLRS systems, and generally long-range strikes, which can cause significant casualties on the Ukrainians fighting in the Kursk region. And that is all for the frontline updates. You are now completely up to date with the current situation, the current and ongoing Russian offensive operations in southern and eastern Ukraine, while the Ukrainians have made a counter-offensive in the Kursk direction, where the objective is to gain control over border areas, create a buffer zone, and prevent the Russians from striking deep into Ukrainian territory, while at the same time holding some Russian territory as a bargaining chip and disrupting their Russian supply line. An additional goal of the Ukrainians in the Kursk direction was to redirect Russian forces from the south and from the east to prevent further offensive operations by the Russians by forcing them to redirect their offensive capabilities to the Kursk direction. However, the Russians have so far not fallen for this trap. Instead, they have completely committed their forces to the south and the east, doubling down on their offensive operations, while at the same time the Russians also had reserves in the Belgorod region during the Kharkiv offensive, which were preparing for an offensive into the Sumy direction, which means that they quickly were able to respond to the Ukrainian offensive without having to redirect forces from the front line. They were able to stabilize somewhat the front line and slow down the Ukrainians significantly. On the first few days, the Ukrainians managed to capture 500 square kilometers. On the following 2 weeks, they've captured an additional 300, and this has significantly slowed down. To sum it all up, the current situation is that the Russians have the initiative on the majority of the front line. The Ukrainians tried to regain the initiative by hitting the Russians where they were weak. Instead, the Russians turned out to be stronger than what the Ukrainians were expecting, and the Russians are doubling down on their own offensive operations, which has taken a significant portion of fortified positions of the Ukrainians and has allowed the Russians to be just a few kilometers within one of the most important supply hubs of the Ukrainians in the Donetsk region. This is significantly improving the Russian positions in the east, while the Kursk direction is not a significant threat to the current Russian positions in this war. This means that all in all, the current situation favors the Russians, and at the same time the power balance also favors the Russians in terms of manpower, equipment, ammunition, supply of weaponry, air superiority, air defense, and pretty much every single factor militarily. The Ukrainians, despite all of that, have managed to hold on for this long, and that just shows their resilience and their ability to defend their own country. However, this has come at a huge cost, both to the manpower of Ukraine and to its economy. This raises questions as to how much longer Ukraine can continue sustaining this war, both in terms of manpower, workforce, and economy, as the Ukrainian supply and continuation of this war is heavily dependent on Western support, specifically Germany, United Kingdom, and the United States, of which the United States is the single biggest supporter of Ukraine. And with the election coming up, it threatens the continuation of supplies being sent from the United States to Ukraine, which could significantly hinder Ukraine's ability to continue offensive operations and defensive operations in the war, and could end up with a Ukrainian capitulation in this war. And that is pretty much everything I want you to know to be able to follow the current conflicts and my daily videos and updates. That is going to be all for this update and video. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.